Welcome to this latest episode of Canonically Speaking. I'm pleased to welcome back today Dr Helen Costigane, who teaches canon law and moral theology at the Mater Ecclesiae College, St Mary's University in Twickenham in southwest London. Dr Costigane spoke to us previously about church finances and property, and today she's going to deal with a topic that's coming more and more under the spotlight, which is what has come to be called spiritual abuse. More specifically, she's going to look at it in the context of the parish. So what it may consist of, how it may be recognised, and how it may be prevented. So, welcome, Dr Costigane, and without further ado, perhaps you could begin by explaining what exactly is meant by the term spiritual abuse.
Thank you. There are many different understandings of spiritual abuse, whether from a religious or secular perspective, and I think that's something that's still unfolding. From a position of authority, it could be posited that such abuse is really just an abuse of office, whether from a religious leader or someone charged with the care of souls. And from a Catholic Christian perspective, or Christian perspective generally, definition of such abuse could be described as something that gets in the way of an individual's relationship with God. The result is that the Christian is not able to grow into the person that God wants them to be, and it affects the close and loving relationship between themselves and God, as Jesus so often described and demonstrated in his teaching and healing ministry. Now, abuse is an emotive word, and I propose that the idea of spiritual abuse could be broken down into subcategories such as harm, neglect, or indifference, and that the attitude of a perpetrator may be from a passive ignorance and ineptitude to a more active coercion, or facilitating dependence rather than empowering the spiritual development of a particular individual. Now, this abuse or ignorance may be from result of a selection process for ministers, formation personnel not picking up key signals, or clerics, once ordained, failing to keep up with their ongoing development, whether it's human or intellectual. A number of years ago, a priest who was coming up for retirement once said to me, "I'm 30 years out of date." And thinking about that later on, I thought he could never get away with saying that if he was a doctor, engineer, lawyer, accountant. So why is the care of souls any less important?
So what would you say is the importance of all this in the specific context of the parish?
Well, the parish is usually the place where most people encounter the idea of church and God and Christ. And we talk about a parish as a certain community of the Christian people. It's entrusted to a pastor who's charged with their spiritual care. And for many people, it's the first and main contact with the church as a whole, with their celebration of the sacraments of initiation. And from that context, the parish becomes their community for growing and living out their lives as Christians. Therefore, what they experience in the parish community has significance for the development in their relationship with God, and the attitude of the pastor has a crucial role to play in this.
In previous podcasts, notably one that we had with Father Justin Glynn, SJ, we've looked at the meaning of vulnerability and how this can vary according to particular circumstances. So who would you say might be considered vulnerable in a parish setting?
Well, I think anybody, the usual minors and possibly people with physical or mental deficiency or whatever. But I think we also have to consider the idea of adults in situations of vulnerability, which may be temporary. Such people might be not vulnerable in the normal sense, but are made vulnerable because of the particular situation. And this would include adults in crisis, suffering from anxiety, depression, or trauma, and who are seeking pastoral, spiritual, or emotional support. or where there's a positional power imbalance, such as a formator and seminarian, a spiritual director and directee, or a priest and parishioner. So I think we have to be aware that the category can be expanded and that people can be temporarily vulnerable.
So could you say a bit more then about these subcategories that you've mentioned?
Okay, I suspect that there are a number of categories, and I've come across instances of all of them, really. Positive harm, neglect or indifference, on the other hand. There might be the passive ignorance and ineptitude or coercion of a person in authority, such as a priest or so on. The ignorance or ineptitude might be a result of a failure in the selection process, in admitting unsuitable candidates, or it might be a sign that clerics, once ordained, fail to engage in their ongoing development, not just intellectual, but also human formation. I'll give you some examples of spiritual abuse which I've encountered. A non-practicing Catholic is denied a Requiem Mass. Father claims that it's the law of the Church. Well, in fact, it isn't. Clearly, a deceased person can't argue for themselves, and being a lapsed Catholic is no bar to receiving a church funeral. The priest in question clearly doesn't understand the relevant canon. And the family, because of bereavement in a position of temporary vulnerability, and declaring their anger, when the time comes, they will refuse a church funeral. So I think that hurt and alienation could have been avoided if the priest had been more diligent in his knowledge and application of canon law.
Because the canon only excludes those who notoriously apostatize from the faith, yeah?
Heretics and schismatics, yeah. Canon 1184. Another case that I came across where a woman who had undergone a therapeutic abortion, the law of the land at the time, it wasn't in England or Wales, was that the husband could agree to an abortion for the sake of her health. She never gave permission for it herself. And she was so she could be said to be in a state of temporary emotional vulnerability. But the priest then came and told her she was excommunicated, which wasn't the case. This exclusion from the Eucharist lasted for 50 years when she sought the help of a canon lawyer and subsequently was able to return to the church. So that kind of real ignorance can cause a great deal of harm. I often say to people that the code of canon law in the wrong hands can be a weapon of mass destruction. We have to interpret it. We have to know the law. Now, there are other cases where it might be that a priest is extremely scrupulous and so on, has his own mental problems, but ends up promoting a harmful understanding of God as a stern father or lawgiver. And he might himself need therapeutic intervention. Having extreme scrupulosity doesn't necessarily bar you from becoming a priest, but you have to be aware that your own thought processes might impact on other people. We also get the guru who likes to gather people around him, encourages dependence rather than helping people in their ongoing relationship with God. That kind of guruism, as it were. And also I think it's very few cases that we have the priest who does the bare minimum in the parish. He has no set times for confession, totally against canon law. It's impossible to get hold of, and so on. And that, I think, does have an impact on people's growth and development in their Christian living, because he is set up to be able to lead them, but he just can't be bothered. But I think somebody in that situation really himself needs intervention to find out what is going on in his own life. So these examples of ignorance, ineptitude, coercive control, and neglect can be said to be abusive in that they stultify or interfere with or deaden people's spiritual growth.
So could you explain a little bit more why these situations may come about?
Yes, I suppose we can talk about different models of priesthood, as it were. This idea that the priest cannot be challenged if he's lazy or ignorant or inept, that sometimes lay people collude with this abusive behaviour. The idea that the priest seems to be separated from others and his own emotional and psychosexual development. I think I found a quote. Oh, it's Eamon Conway says that people tend to act out of a negative image of God in terms of their distinctive theological human formation, and the presence of this kind of God imagery raises serious questions about its nature and adequacy. And he also talks about different, as I said, different models of the priesthood, the man in the margins, the prophetic person, the bridge builder, and so on. I did once have a priest say to me that he was more interested in things like social justice than liturgy. And that surprised me, because I think one of the things that the priest does, which nobody else can do, is liturgy. People can lead prayers, services and things like that. But for a priest to say that was quite surprising. And I never observed him saying Mass, so I don't know what it was like. But that kind of alarmed me, I think. So I think having to understand what goes on in their own lives, being self-aware and so on, which should come through in terms of their formation.
Now, one of your responsibilities is that of being part of a formation team at the seminary. And could you say something about the process of formation in terms of preventing spiritual abuse or helping people recognize what it can consist of?
Yes, we lay a lot of emphasis on human formation as well as the other aspects of intellectual, spiritual and pastoral. Now, it was interesting that the 1917 Code placed great emphasis on prayer and reception of the sacraments and instruction of the laws of true and Christian courtesy. And I think it's fair to say that the 1917 Code, the focus was on the intellectual and spiritual development. The pastoral aspect of formation was undeveloped, and the idea of human or personal development was more or less non-existent. And there was an emphasis on separation so that boys who gave sign of an ecclesiastical vocation were kept with special care from the contagion on the world. And from that, a number of older priests today speak of the being unprepared to face the reality of parish life. But then since that, we've had the Second Vatican Council's decree on the training of priests and so on. And the 1983 Code requires that each country have a program of priestly formation. And we talked about spiritual formation, intellectual formation, and pastoral formation. And then one area that seems to be underdeveloped in the 83 Code is in relation to the human aspect. Now, there are implied references to fraternity, common life, or association, but it's not till we get to the Ratio Fundamentalis of 2016 where it becomes really important. And I think that's a really important new dynamic. If I might quote from this, it says the fundamental idea is that seminaries should form missionary disciples who are in love with the Master, with the smell of the sheep, who live in their midst to bring the mercy of God to them. Hence, every priest should always feel that he is a disciple on a journey and integrated formation, understood as a continuous configuration to Christ. So in terms of formation, we put as much emphasis on human formation. What does celibacy mean? What does obedience mean? How are they going to relate to ordinary parishioners? How are they going to work with volunteers? What kind of level of self-awareness do they have? And are they open to direction and guidance and those aspects that they might want to develop? So the intellectual is important. We don't want stupid priests, obviously. Spiritual formation is very important. We want priests to pray. Pastoral formation is really important in exposing them to different pastoral situations. But the human development is equally important because we want them to be well-rounded, self-aware individuals who know and can relate to other people.
And how do you see this continuing after ordination, when they're out of the seminary?
There has been talk about appraisals, like and you get it in ordinary work. I don't know that the word appraisal is welcome generally. We talk about perhaps mentoring individuals because it can be quite a shock to the system when they go out into the parish and so on, although it should be less of a shock, I think, if they've had good parish experiences. Now, the idea of appraisal, I think it was described by the Bishops' Conference in 1999. It talks about a regular review would help each one to see how to make even better use of his gifts and to improve his service in areas in which he's not quite happy. It would enable him to ask for courses and formation better suited to his needs. The people he serves, the local church or diocese, and the church at large would then benefit from the process. But as I said, probably mentorship is an idea that might track with priests. There's also in the code the obligation to continue ongoing formation. I'm not sure what the situation is across the Diocese of England and Wales or whatever, but sometimes this isn't taken up, and sometimes the priests don't like the courses that are being offered, or there's pressure on clergy time because of the demands of the parish. But it is important that time is made for that.
Perhaps that also ought to be part of the seminary formation, to teach the need for ongoing direction, guidance, mentorship, because the energies that you build up during your 7 years of seminary, they eventually run out and then you're on your own. So it is quite a challenge, I think, for bishops and for the individual priests to find a system of ongoing formation, encouragement and recharging of batteries and ideas and keeping up to date. So do you have any final thoughts then about all this idea of spiritual abuse?
Involving women in the selection process for candidates for the priesthood, involving them in formation work is a good way forward. James Canon, who's a Catholic theologian, he says that the voice of women is particularly important, and he formulated what he called the gallant rule. He says, in the church and in the academy, too many decisions are made by men only. It is as if the claims of patriarchy have not been disclosed time and time again. There is no reason for the absence of women. The simple rule that I propose of guaranteeing the presence of women at every deliberation ought to be made known throughout the world, ought to insist on it at every occasion. And I think there are women involved in the seminary, which is wonderful, in the selection process, I believe. And so I think it gives a different voice. And also, I think in the pastoral assignments that the seminarians are given, there are women in charge. They have to be able to work with women, and women can often size them up better than maybe men can. So I think there's a lot of positive steps being taken going forward, which I think will minimise the idea of the abuse that I've mentioned.
So it's a new idea, or at least a new focus perhaps. And how do you see it developing, or how do you see attitudes towards it developing, or what should be the approach of the authorities now?
I think the Ratio Fundamentalis 2016 has certainly been embedded in the seminaries. I think there's an understanding that younger priests need support, that older priests also need support because many of them are run ragged and might face burnout and so on. So I think the care of priests, both from bishops and from lay people, is vitally important. Looking after them, because when they're gone, as it were. And I saw the work that's been done in the seminary, I think will continue, but supporting them at each stage going forward, I think is so important. But also, I don't think lay people are slow to challenge some priests, and not often in a positive way either. I would fear that we have this consumer-led culture that the priest is there just to provide everything that's going, without any responsibility on the part of lay people. So I think we have to guard against that and realise that priests need to be supported, need to be cared for, and not subject to undue criticism.
Yeah, I think that some of these instances that you've mentioned could be solved if the priest had a priest friend who could just say, maybe you were a bit heavy-handed with that woman, or whatever, you've refused her a funeral, or you've said she's excommunicate. Actually, that's not right. If somebody could just have a friendly word, it might resolve a lot of these situations. But if a priest is on his own, he's his own advisor and his own consultant and his own boss, then there's nobody to whisper in his ear, is there really? So,
exactly. I often say to my students, I said, if you don't know the canon law, ask somebody. Don't make it up as you go along. That's really important. Don't be afraid to consult with people. That's why they're there. And I think we are encouraging priests to have friends, priestly friends, lay people friends, and that they can talk to. And a spiritual direction is very important as well. And it certainly I think all of the young ones that I know have their own spiritual director, because that is so important to help them, keep them on track, to have somebody to bounce ideas off and to somebody to check in with. I think that's really important.
well, it's good that you've raised these issues so that people can be aware of them, and we'll see how things develop. And for the moment, then, I would say thank you, Dr. Costigane, for the fascinating insights which you've provided today into spiritual abuse. And perhaps we're all on a path of learning in order to be able to identify it and take whatever measures we can at the individual and collective level to prevent it. So no doubt we'll meet again for further discussions on canonical topics. So in the meantime, I wish you every success in your valuable work, and so for now, goodbye and God bless.
Thank you.
Thank you again to my guest today, Dr. Helen Costigane. And thank you to Imma Setiadi for her rendition of C.P. Bach's Solfeggetto, which opens and closes this podcast. I'm Fr Paul Hayward, and you've been listening to Canonically Speaking. Please be sure to subscribe and follow wherever you get your podcasts for more interesting conversations from the world of canon law. And if you have any questions, comments, or even suggestions of guests for future episodes, then please do contact the show on canonicallyspeakingpodcast@gmail.com. We'd love to hear from you. So until the next time, goodbye and God bless.